Hello and welcome to our second part in this short two-part series about Mark Antony as a soldier and commander. I remember when I gave this talk originally I called it The Swaggering Soldier, Antony as General, Part 2, and this was 41 to 30 BC. Now Part 1 came out beginning of last month, this one's coming out at the beginning of February. Hopefully people will have watched the first one before they come on to this because it will make more sense, although we will be covering the campaigns today in some detail, therefore you should be able to follow it even if you haven't, but it does make more sense. This is really intended to be the sequel to Part 1. He's just stopped. Augustus the cat was yelling rather loudly outside and might resume doing that at some point, but obviously he's putting in his two penneth worth about his opinion of Mark Antony. The idea of the talk was to try and put his military career into context. The simplicity of Shakespeare, of the movie versions, the on-screen version of Mark Antony is Mark Antony, very much the hardened, tough, hard-drinking, womanizing, but very capable soldier who is outwitted by the unhealthy, almost effete, but very wily, very cold and calculating Octavian Augustus. It's a stereotype, it works very well dramatically, but it greatly distorts the truth. There are elements of it in the historical record, but an awful lot of it fits more neatly a difference that Plutarch emphasized to try and make his life of Mark Antony that much more dramatic. Part of what we did in the first video was to emphasize that Mark Antony, like every Roman senator, every Roman public figure, had to be politician as well as soldier. And even people like Pompey, whose career was dominated by military experience in the early stages of his life and went into the political sphere in Rome rather late and without much experience or expertise in understanding. You know, he's supposed to have had one of his associates write a manual for him to explain how the Senate, how government worked. So there are exceptions, but even someone like that ends up in the cut and thrust of politics at Rome and has to deal with trading favours, persuading people, working the system, the way the calendar works, the different institutions work, all of that sort of thing. Mark Antony has some military experience, though not an exceptional amount by Roman standards, particularly by the standards of that generation that gets caught up in the civil war, so ends up fighting even more than usual. But, you know, by Roman standards, a very decent, a fairly substantial amount of military experience, just not exceptional. But he also showed a great deal of ability in politics, and most of his association with Julius Caesar, Caesar employed him as a political agent, and in a political role rather than a directly military one. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't rate Mark Antony as a soldier, it just means that he felt that his cause would be better served by Mark Antony doing other things, which does rather suggest, and his record does suggest, for all the getting drunk or turning up with a hangover when he's supposed to be dispensing justice, receiving petitions, that sort of thing, on the whole, Antony does a fairly good job of keeping Italy stable while Caesar is away fighting the different campaigns of the Civil War. So Antony the politician can often be buried by this simple stereotype that he himself promoted of Antony the soldier and nothing else, and the simple direct man of action. This was someone who was considered to be a very gifted orator, even if Cicero didn't like his style. It was too florid, too Asiatic by his standards. Yet Antony is a very good public speaker, and obviously the most famous occasion is the funeral speech for Julius Caesar after the assassination, where he rouses the crowd against the conspirators. Now, Shakespeare's version's marvellous piece of writing and shows how oratory worked. We don't know whether it reflects what he actually said because none of the sources record in any detail what he actually said, and there are contradictions between the different accounts. But it was a great performance. So remember Antony, the charismatic political orator, rabble-rouser if you want, on some occasions, but also someone who could manipulate things within the system. Right, I'm just going to take a little bit of a drink, and it's apple juice. I haven't gone down the Mark Antony line of drinking heavily to make this this video somehow more appropriate. But as always, the This time of year, there's always a cough lingering around, so the voice doesn't necessarily hold up to it. So we have Antony as a very able politician with some military experience. If we look in more detail at that, again, go back to the other video if you want the full account. He was a particularly dashing, imaginative, bold cavalry commander in his early operations, serving in Judea a little bit. They're less probably there with cavalry, but then in Egypt. He does reasonably well as Caesar. When he serves under Caesar, he is a subordinate, and most of the time he's not a fully independent role, but he serves very well and capably at fairly senior subordinate level. And his record is pretty good, and Caesar trusts him with, for instance, the left flank of Pharsalus, which is next to the right flank. It's a very important station, even though in that particular battle all the main tactical matters occurred, and the tactical moments, the sort of critical moments of the battle occurred elsewhere on the right flank in the centre. Nevertheless, Antony is trusted to go off, keep the left secure, so I don't have to worry about that as commander. Caesar trusts him with that job, and he fulfills it admirably. You then have in the Civil War where, again, this is very much political, and there are cases where Antony tries to bribe some troops to support him, but some legions that have been formed by Julius Caesar contain a lot of Caesar's men, were there ready for the big expedition against the Parthians. They defect, they join Octavian. Partly Octavian outbids Mark Antony, but also the point to remember, we tried to emphasize, is that Antony wouldn't have been known personally to large parts of Caesar's army, because he hadn't actually spent all that much time on campaign, because Caesar had been using him for other very important roles. So the idea that that Antony knows all the tribunes, all the centurions, the men recognize him, wasn't the case. Some parts of the army were like that, but most had not served under him. The campaign is difficult, it's messy, it's got large armies involved, but there are small numbers of troops, like some of the legions Antony has, some of the ones Octavian has, that are experienced, composed around a core at least of veterans of Caesar's campaigns, highly motivated, more skillful, and these consistently outperform the other units that are more recently raised. He loses at Forum Gallorum after initial success, keeps his army together, it doesn't break up. Then again, political manoeuvring, joins with Lepidus and Octavian to form the Second Triumvirate, turn against Decimus Brutus and the other conspirators, and overrun Italy and Rome. And from that alliance, which again, there's the military element in that he's kept his army together, he's made it, he's persuaded his men to follow him to do this, but also the political sense of sniffing the wind and arranging a deal. We don't entirely know who is the prime mover in this, and everybody tends to assume it's Octavian Augustus because, well, he's such a wily character. But you should give some credit to Mark Antony as well. So that then leads to the Philippi campaign, where he and Octavian, the man who'd eventually be Augustus, lead this massive army against the almost equally massive army formed by Brutus and Cassius. These are gargantuan forces by Roman standards, far more legions than have served in one place before. And that creates all sorts of problems of command and control, let alone supply. So the campaign is one where Mark Antony clearly stands out as the ablest of the four commanders there and the most successful. He doesn't suffer a reverse, whereas Cassius does, Octavian does, Brutus does in the second battle, and was unable to exploit his success in the first battle. There may be elements where Antony's getting too closely involved with the details of a particular sector, but then the problem is, with such a large battle, this has really strained the ability of the Roman military system for a general to command and keep close control over the army, because it's simply too big. And in the terrain at Philippi, where you have some of it fought in marshland and other areas where you simply can't see very far, that restricts what he can do. So you can explain it all, and the aim of these talks is to understand and explain. It's not to say he's the best, he's the worst, whatever it might be. It's just trying to understand them and place it all within a Roman context. That brings us to where we start today. Philippi was the great victory. Brutus and Cassius both commit suicide, so they've gone. All the other major conspirators are dead. There are a few around. Some of them will be killed as late as Actium and that campaign. A few having joined Mark Antony. Obviously, it's very difficult for them to join Octavian by this stage. But basically, the liberators, as any sort of organised group, and all their most distinguished men are gone after this. Antony and Octavian and Lepidus formally are left as triumvirs in charge, in supervisory role of the entire Roman world and its provinces and its territory controlled through allies. Lepidus will be sidelined fairly soon. But Antony has this great fame. He is given the eastern half of the Mediterranean. Now, you can look at this from various ways. You can see Italy as the plum in one sense. Obviously, that's where Rome is. That's where you can attempt to re-establish a legitimate republic. But also, Italy has lots of problems. There are all sorts of veterans who are crying out to be given the land they've been promised in reward for fighting for you. You're going to have to take that land, confiscate that land from other people. You've got Sextus Pompey, based primarily in Sicily, but with a large fleet that is able to threaten and at times cut off supplies of food coming to Italy. And Italy in general, Rome in particular, relies very much on imported grain. So there are all sorts of problems. It's a politically challenging area. Now, there's the chance of great success, but there's also the chance of messing up. So people can see Octavian as having the raw end of the deal, and Antony getting the plum, which is the rich, prosperous and eastern Mediterranean. But again, that doesn't quite work. This is a challenging area to deal with. It's been disrupted by Pompey during the last civil war, because that's where he drew most of his support for the campaign that would lead to Pharsalus. But that's how he built up his power in Greece, Macedonia, to wait for Caesar. Caesar comes through, defeats Pompey, and then reorganizes the East, so people who supported Pompey have to come to Caesar to remain in power. People like Cleopatra, obviously, eventually, but lots of other dynast leaders, civic leaders in communities throughout the East. Some succeed, some fail. He appoints new people, he recognizes some. All of that's happened. Then Brutus and Cassius have turned up, and the process had to be gone through again. So again, Roman warlords have appeared. They've demanded money, they've demanded resources of all sorts, and your loyalty. And they've chosen the people they feel most likely to give them that. So various leaders have lost power or have had to cling on to it by very quickly switching between different Roman rivals. Now, Brutus and Cassius are dead, so Antony is coming to do exactly the same thing again, and there's a major administrative task which, on the whole, he performs very well. He does settle the eastern provinces, although there will be a bigger threat that we'll get onto in a moment. There's probably an assumption, there seems to be talk from very early on that there might be a Parthian expedition involved in some point, so he has an opportunity which Octavian doesn't have to lead a grand and glorious foreign war. Clean military victory. You're not fighting fellow Romans, you're going to be fighting enemies. Remember, the Parthians are the people who've killed Crassus, wiped out a large part of his army. They've done the same to one of Caesar's subordinates in the last few years. A smaller scale disaster, but a disaster nevertheless. So Antony has a lot to do. There are priorities. You've got vengeance for Crassus. People, as I say, they'd expected Caesar to lead this great expedition. He was going to Dacia as well first, but mainly Parthia. That was the big plan had he not been murdered on the Ides of March 44. Dolabella, who goes out there and gets killed in a civil war, he talked about similar things, and now it's Mark Antony. The burden of that has fallen upon it, and there are considerable resources to do this and supreme authority. But a lot of what he's doing to start off with comes more into the political, diplomatic, administrative area, and he does settle the eastern provinces. And, there's the direct element of, obviously, you appoint new Roman governors to control those areas, make sure they've got the garrisons to do it where there are provinces, but also it's all these allied and communities, kingdoms. You have talk of Antony favouring, Glaphyra's son in Cappadocia because she slept with him, and of course then you have Cleopatra and the beginning of that relationship in a formal way, and it is spectacular. You get it reflected in Shakespeare. It comes from Plutarch of her arrival at Tarsus along the river in this spectacular barge, and that's where whatever Hollywood does, and there's that slightly weird scene when she arrives in Rome to greet Caesar on this sort of mobile Sphinx-type platform thing with all the dancers and the true sort of Hollywood musical look about it. There are elements, though, where the lifestyle of the Ptolemies and their public performance actually does. We probably get a flavour of it from the Hollywood version, not necessarily of the detail, but of the way they thought about things. And that wonderful scene of Antony dispensing justice in the marketplace, and gradually the cloud just drifts off because the rumour comes of, wow, look what's coming up the river, you've got to see this, until he's left with nobody but his clerk, and then he goes and follows, and then all their entertainment. That's the spectacular bit. That is really the sort of the icing on the cake of the administrative program that does settle the East pretty effectively, at least in the short term, because as we'll see, a crisis is going to appear. He ends up spending the winter of 41-40 in Alexandria. It seems a bit like a holiday, and all the stories of him feasting and enjoying himself with Cleopatra, doing the classic thing, which has all these Greek origins of basically disguising themselves as, in inverted commas, poor people and wandering the streets after a good party, sort of, jostling people, having some fights, getting involved in all this sort of thing, mixing with the common herd whilst remaining very definitely rich and protected. All of that's there, and surely does reflect the reality, and you do feel there is genuine emotion in this. Remember, Antony's got to be pretty exhausted by this time as well, because an awful lot has happened in the last decade of his life, and particularly in the last few years of his life, and he's gone from despair in the immediate aftermath of Caesar's murder and thinking, well, I'm consul, but how long am I going to last? Despair after the defeat at Forum Glorum, retreating through the Alps, but holding himself together, holding the army together. Difficult moments at several stages, and a lot of political manoeuvring, a lot of work, a lot of campaigning. That's going to take their toll of somebody who is now into middle age. So it might be that he did just want to break in the same way that Caesar does seem to need, or feel he needs, those months of leisure time cruising along the Nile with Cleopatra. He needs to switch off. Before he does this, he sends a cavalry raiding force against the city of Palmyra. At this stage, Palmyra is probably, to some degree, an ally of Rome, but not really considered part of Rome's imperium, Rome's empire, or at least maybe they didn't consider themselves part of it anyway. He doesn't achieve much. He went, the ostensible reason is that he wanted plunder, he wanted funds. They're able to evacuate most of the vital stuff. This might well be seen as provocative from a Parthian point of view. Remember, after Carrhae, 53 BC, when Crassus has been killed, the Parthians in the next few years have raided into Syria, culminating late in 51 BC, when there's a large-scale attack on Antioch, which is defeated by Cassius, the acting quaestor and acting governor, because the Senate hadn't bothered to send out anybody else. It was so busy with other issues, since he was Crassus's 2IC, second in command, so takes over effectively. He repulses a Parthian force, kills one of their commanders, ambushing the Parthians in wooded and broken country, this sort of thing. But the Parthians have attacked into the Roman provinces. They would obviously see it as reprisals for the Roman assault on when Crassus advanced across the Euphrates and went into their territory. Though again, the background to that might well be intervention in a civil war. Go back to there's a longer video on Carrhae I did quite a while ago that is of interest if you want to look at the details of that. The urgency comes from the winter of 41 to 40, which is when Antony is having this holiday in Egypt. So again, it's one of those things. It's the being caught on the golf course equivalent when a crisis occurs, when a disaster occurs, when an attack occurs. It's that equivalent for Mark Antony. So it doesn't look particularly good. The big assault comes by the Parthians, led by Pacorus, who's the favourite son of the current great king, Orodes II. Also with the force of Quintus Labienus, Parthicus as he styles himself, and he mints coins to that effect. He's the son of the Labienus who'd fought with such distinction under Caesar during the Gallic campaigns, and then joined Pompey during the Civil War, and eventually died in Spain in 45 BC, having been a very tough opponent and determined opponent of Julius Caesar. Again, that's another issue to talk about as to how we might understand that and why that happened. The son had fled, or had been sent to by Brutus and Cassius to Parthia with an idea of gaining some aid, allies, resources of some sort, hiring mercenaries, whatever it might be. The details are difficult to establish because obviously from a propaganda point of view, the enemies of the conspirators wanted to say, well, they're trying to get foreign aid to fight against good, honest Romans. He styles himself Parthicus. Now, normally a Roman will only give himself the name of a foreign people through having defeated them. And this, curiously enough, he gives it to himself when he's allied with them. So it's a break with how things are normally done, but nevertheless, it shows this allegiance, this willingness to fight with foreigners because you claim to be the true representative of the Roman state and Roman government, and those in power at the moment are a faction who've seized power illegally, and therefore any means necessary can be used against them. They overrun Syria very quickly. They support one of the rivals in a Judean dynastic struggle. Antigonus supplants his uncle Hyrcanus. The Parthians back this. They send quite a small force. It's numbering in hundreds, not thousands, and this is enough to tip the balance in this civil war within the Hasmonean Jewish kingdom. Interestingly, he pays them money, and also 500 aristocratic women are to be given over. Now, that's obviously getting rid of some of the families of your enemies and your rivals, perhaps some hostages from your side as well, and it comes into this Parthian idea of the harem and politics conducted through women who will become wives or concubines of particularly the great king, but to some extent as well the great men, and linking up areas in that way. Labienus, apparently on his own, without Parthian aid, overruns Asia, and that area, Asia Minor, sort of modern-day Turkey, that region. It almost looks as if the Parthians are willing to go as far as Syria and consider that to be part of the old Seleucid kingdom which they've inherited, they've taken over, and therefore rightfully theirs. You could also say, well, there's, it's part of the Achaemenid Persian kingdom as well, so if they're claiming a link to that, then which they appear to do in some diplomatic exchanges, at least according to Roman sources, doesn't really appear in what little we have from the Parthian perspective. But there do seem to be limits. So Labienus, with his Roman force, his allies, his mercenaries, goes into Asia Minor, but the Parthians do not. The problem is, all this crisis, a large part of the territory that Antony's been given as his enlarged province has been overrun by foreign invaders and by a rival Roman in Labienus. However, at the same time, by early there's problems in Italy which will culminate in the Perusine War when Mark Antony's brother rebels against Octavian. You have the siege of Perusia, all those obscene and generally rude sling bullets or artillery bullets, depending on what they are. Most people count the sling bullets, but there was a theory they're actually shot by light ballistae. And, there's all the insults to Fulvia and this sort of thing. So Antony goes to Italy rather than dealing with the foreign invasion. So there is a lull. The Parthians and Labienus are successful for more than a year overrunning this territory because Antony's attention is elsewhere. Italy is what matters. The power struggles between other Romans, that's what matters. And obviously it is difficult because this does appear to be a complete breakdown of the alliance with Octavian, because your brother's involved, your wife appears to be involved, she's been raising troops to support him. She wasn't at Perusia, she wasn't actually present at the siege, and all this exaggeration of, a woman putting on armour and a sword and giving orders to troops and all this sort of thing, that doesn't seem to reflect reality. Nevertheless, she had done what a good aristocratic wife should do, particularly if you're a very determined and capable character like Fulvia, and you are supporting what you consider to be your husband's interests and your family interests as strongly as you possibly can. Fulvia and her mother flee to Sextus Pompey. Sextus Pompey is very active at this time. There's minor fighting when Antony arrives in Italy. There's a cavalry action, Octavian's men, leading to the Peace of Brundisium. They negotiate. The armies don't seem to be inclined to fight each other in 39. and people like Ventidius Bassus, who we'll see again in a moment, they're not that keen. So it shows again some of the limits of what Roman soldiers will do at this time. There tends to be this assumption that, well, they'll fight anybody, anytime, as long as they're paid, they're rewarded, they're promised land on discharge. That isn't always the case. There are several incidents where troops will refuse to fight or be very reluctant or persuade their leaders, put pressure on them to negotiate. That's what happens here. They're willing to fight against Sextus Pompey. They had been willing to fight against Brutus and Cassius. They aren't particularly interested in fighting for Antony against Octavian. There's obviously a lot more to it. We can't really go into the details of the Perusine War and all this thing then. So you then have his subordinates who fight wars over the next few years, because Antony is busy with politics, and Italy is the main focus of his attention. Very sensibly, very pragmatically, he is part of this triumvirate. He needs to make sure that he has the backing and influence, and somebody at Rome essentially has his back, is looking after his interests there, and he is not at open war with Octavian, because also he doesn't want to fight that open war whilst there are problems with a big Parthian invasion and on other frontiers. So you have, for a couple of years, Antony's subordinates do his fighting for him, and he is much busier with politics, again at times with threats of violence, but he spends several years much more focused on Italy. He doesn't see Cleopatra in this time. This is the big break where for best part of 4 years he does not spend any time with her at all. They might correspond and all that, but part of the negotiations will lead to his marriage to Octavia, Octavian's sister. They will honeymoon in Athens, or not honeymoon, but they'll spend a prolonged holiday there, where again he has one of these sort of breaks where he takes off his military uniform, dresses as a civilian, goes to philosophical lectures, all this sort of thing. Accompanied by his wife, who seems to take an active interest in this as well. They have 2 daughters very quickly. So, this is not a formality. This is a marriage that has important political aspects, but also seems to work by the standards of the Roman aristocracy. And quite possibly, they may have been happy at the start. There is the impression in the sources they actually get on quite well. Octavia is a widow because her first husband, Marcellus, substantially older than her, even compared to Mark Antony, has by this time died, but he'd been a consul, he'd been a very prominent member of a very prominent family. So, Plutarch emphasizes this. You can get it in Shakespeare, though there are several. Antony and Cleopatra has more scenes in it than any other play. I think that's right. It's one of the longest, but I think it is actually it does have the most, many of which tend to be edited out and not performed in most stage versions. So you have stuff in there, if you look at the full text, about Ventidius Bassus fighting the Parthians and others. You have Pollio goes to Macedonia. Asinius Pollio, he's famous as a historian, gets more attention probably because Robert Graves used him as a character in I Claudius. Sadly, his histories are lost, which is a great shame. Publius Ventidius Bassus, who'd been consul in 43, is sent to the east. Now, he's a fascinating figure, and we probably will do a video on him at some point. Because as a boy, he'd been led in triumph by Pompeius Strabo. That's, the father of Pompey the Great. Because he'd been involved in his community, been involved in the social war. So he's someone who's been a prisoner at a Roman triumph. He was a muleteer or mule raiser, praefectus fabrum for Julius Caesar. We talked about this a little bit last time. He's extremely competent. First off, he defeats Labienus, goes through the Taurus Mountains, beats the Parthians twice. He outmaneuvers them, outthinks them, outwits them. Very careful choice of terrain, strong position, and he persuades and lures the Parthians forward to attack him on ground of his choosing, which doesn't suit their cavalry. Some have argued from the sources that there is more emphasis on the Parthians, on their cataphracts rather than their horse archers, so they don't spend as much time wearing the enemy down as they had at Carrhae and instead launch a big assault. That could make sense given that they have, after all, smashed Crassus's army. So the Parthians, who already feel themselves better than anybody else they've ever fought because they've conquered this big empire, might well have just thought, well, the Romans are just as bad as all the other enemies we've fought. have the same overconfidence that Crassus probably had before Carrhae, because they're expecting to win because they always do, because they're Roman. So it might well be that, particularly with the influence of an ambitious, pretty much heir to the throne, Pacorus, are too willing to attack too boldly and suffer as a result. But again, we'd like more detail about these battles. There are fragments, really, and short accounts. The Roman infantry counterattacks, supported by slingers and archers. Pacorus gets killed, he's beheaded. There's the Cilician Gates in 39, Mount Amanus in 38. So the Parthian invasion is evicted pretty smartly by Ventidius Bassus with relatively modest resources. You know, he has a more typical Roman army of sort of 3 or 4 legions, that sort of size plus allies, rather than the gargantuan armies that had fought at Philippi. And that's going to be significant for what comes later. So again, this is a very capable, experienced Roman general. He is awarded a triumph over the Parthians, and for a very long time is the only Roman who has one of those. Celebrates it and then disappears. There's probably nothing sinister about that, and the thought that people considered him a rival. He's, you know, getting on by this time. He's had a pretty checkered career, and also most people, he's achieved what a Roman aristocrat would want, and somebody who's become a Roman aristocrat as part of the social war and worked his way up, reasonably enough, has similar ambitions. So he goes off, he wins his victory. We don't know how long he lived. He simply doesn't appear anymore after that. But Antony's honour, in a sense, has been saved, and the area put under his charge has been restored to Roman control through the actions of a legatus sent out as a provincial governor, as a commander. And he's done it extremely well. But while all this has been going on, Antony has still been very busy. Peace of Misenum in 39 BC with Sextus Pompey, that broke down. The marriage to Octavia, they winter in Athens 39-38. So while Ventidius is campaigning, Antony is having a vacation with his new bride in Athens, this great cultural centre. And again, it emphasises, partly because of Cicero, we see Antony as this brute. This is someone with a great love for Hellenic culture, in particular, as so many Roman aristocrats had. And somebody, whilst he doesn't write more than one book, and that defending his, you know, on his drinking, on his drunkenness, nevertheless, it doesn't mean he doesn't have an interest in this cultural aspect, as many aristocrats had, as well as the performance element, the dramatic. You know, he's had a great interest and association with people from the stage, theatricals in the past, that is not considered quite proper for an aristocrat, but because Antony thinks of himself as such an aristocrat that he can do what he likes. In the summer of 38, he's summoned by Octavian over, so goes, but Octavian isn't at Brundisium when Antony arrives, so Antony gives up on that. It's again because of the priorities. Octavian is having real problems dealing with Sextus Pompey, that's revived, and other threats in Italy. Antony gets out to the east late in 38, he goes to Commagene, there's the siege of Samosata, where he relieves Ventidius, who goes home and triumphs in November of that year. So that's all that's then done. Antony gives generous terms to the king because he's unable to get military victory before the campaigning season ends, winter comes on. And again, perhaps it's to emphasise, look, I'm here, you know, you've had my tough subordinate, it's sort of good cop, bad cop stuff. Now you can deal with me, surrender because I'll be nice to you. And there's, you know, that's a well-established, proper Roman way of conducting business. You know, as long as you get the balance right, as long as you do things in the interest of the Roman Republic, then you can be merciful, you can deal with people who have fought against you. You don't have to beat everyone down to utter submission. As long as they show that they're, you know, they're apologetic and they're now willing to do what you want them to do. 37 BC, so the next campaigning season is again lost because he's summoned to another meeting over in Italy This one seems to get even more tense. He arrives with a fleet, perhaps more ships than Octavian's people were expecting. They're not permitted to go into Brundisium, so they go to Tarentum. However, there is an agreement. He agrees to loan Octavian 120 warships in return for the promise of 20,000 legionaries. That's the figure that appears in the sources. Does 20,000, is that shorthand for 4 legions, assuming each one is 5,000 men? Plutarch only says 2 legions, but also 1,000 Praetorians as a gift from Octavia. Now, it's an interesting thing, and we'll look at the Praetorian Guard and other guard and elite units another day. I know I say that all the time, but we are dealing with a huge, huge subject, so there's lots of things to be talking about for lots of years to come. My rambling style is confused and Ronnie Corbett enough in the first place, not to start digressing off into other things. The only thing I would say at this point, there is a clear distinction maintained in the sources for this period that the Praetorians are equipped and look different to ordinary legionaries. Now, whether that's because the equipment is simply more ornate or is different in some other way, harder to say. Personally, I suspect it's more ornate, but maybe the armour's a bit heavier. Maybe you've even got people with greaves still or something. Who knows? But there's something different. They are distinct, and they're also perceived to be, obviously, an elite, that they are picked men. So there might be an element of height or size or simply experience or levels of training, all of those things. But they do seem to have been different. And it's interesting when you come on to the origins of the Praetorian Guard. We're more familiar with the bodyguard of the Roman emperors. Those come from Octavia. Antony then returns, and this time he winters in 37 to 36 in Antioch in Syria. And this time Cleopatra comes there and shows him the twin children that she's had in the meantime. So that's the first time he's seen her for best part of 4 years. But for all that, no doubt happy reunion, the big theme, the big topic, and his main effort would be preparations for a very large-scale expedition in the following year, in 36 BC, once the campaigning season arrives, to deal with the Parthians. Now, by this time, Orodes II had abdicated in favour of another son of Phraates IV, who promptly massacred almost the entire family. Parthian noblemen fled to Antony. Parthia must have seemed vulnerable, so there were added elements. Crassus had planned to go, perhaps he was a little bit late, or events had moved faster than he expected, but felt the background to that intervention was a Parthian civil war between 2 brothers who've combined to murder their father and then fallen out with each other. One of whom had appealed to Gabinius before for support, so had asked the Romans to intervene in this. Something similar is probably going on at this point. So from the Roman perspective, this is a good time to intervene. Late in 37, or very early in 36, Publius Canidius Crassus, one of his subordinates, had campaigned in Armenia, perhaps preparing the way for the operation. The plan is to attack Media, Atropine, roughly modern Azerbaijan, but very roughly. He's not planning to attack Mesopotamia and drive in that direction down the Tigris-Euphrates towards Ctesiphon, Seleucia, the big cities of that area of Babylonia, which Crassus had done. And some people allege that what Antony's doing is Caesar's plan, but given how vague the sources are for that and the fact that we don't know really, he didn't live to do it, we can't be too sure about that. But the idea being that you're going through Armenia into Medea in areas that are more broken, more mountainous, though again that's a generalization, but perhaps less obviously favourable country for a cavalry-based army like the Parthians. The army, there's clear signs that he'd learnt some lessons from Ventidius Bassus's success, and perhaps people who'd been sitting down and thinking, well, what went wrong at Carrhae? What should we do next time? There's lots of allied auxiliary troops. Plutarch claims 10,000 cavalry, mostly from Spain and Gaul, allegedly plus extra allies. There were planned to be 6,000 more Armenian cavalry, plus 7,000 infantry, 30,000 allies altogether. Many of the infantry missile armed, so slingers, particularly javelin men, some bowmen as well probably, but the slings seem to predominate, and that again appears to be part of the lesson learnt by Ventidius Bassus, or demonstrated by him. Something to remember as well is that obviously a horse archer relies more on his speed to avoid being hit by missiles. A cataphract relies far more on the protection that he and his horse have. A sling bullet hitting hard against a helmet can give a man concussion even if it doesn't penetrate. So there's an element where slings are more effective than arrows because they don't necessarily have to penetrate the armor. They can cause these injuries in other ways. So that can make some sense. It may also be the availability. There are simply more slingers around than there are good, experienced archers. Again, with both of these skills, unlike a modern firearm, obviously you're more effective the better trained you are, but the basic energy from the weapon comes from chemical energy rather than from the muscle energy of the operator. So a sling, a bow, you have to practice a lot to be very good at these, and particularly with a bowman, the draw strength, the power of the bow you can use, the type of bow you can use, that relies very much on long practice, long training. So you have to be a little bit careful. It's much harder to say that a bow can do this, can shoot at this range, can be this effective, compared to, say, a matchlock musket or a modern rifle. The skill of the operator is even more important than it is with more modern technology. Anyway, it's a very big army. It's lots of light troops, lots of missile troops, lots of cavalry, and then 60,000 legionaries, supposedly. So a grand total of 100,000 men. Plutarch mentions a third legion, and detachment of 2 legions, but does not give a total number of legions. Velleius Paterculus, writing under Tiberius in the 1st century AD, says 13 legions were involved. Other sources 15, 16, even 18. Modern consensus tends to be 16, but not really based on any evidence. That's just a guess that we've settled on as, well, we quite like that. But it's, there's no more reason that that's right than the 13 or any of the others. Appian does say that Julius Caesar had planned to use 16, for what that's worth. The size of these legions is not clear. Probably they're under strength. They're unlikely to be 5,000 or so. And obviously even 13 legions would produce more than the total of 60,000 men if that was the case, let alone 16. Probably they're under strength because probably on most occasions Roman legions do tend to be under strength, just like the units in very many armies throughout history, because it's very hard to keep up those numbers. There is a prestige associated with having more legions. That's particularly true in the Civil War era when you're going up against other Roman armies. You want to show you've got more Romans than they have. There's also the added advantage that those legions create lots of senior posts, lots of commissions effectively to give out, so you can commission people, you can promote them and win their gratitude. There are more opportunities to do that simply because there are more posts available. So there are reasons why, but this is, by any standards, even compared to the Philippi campaign, this is an exceptionally large Roman army. This is far more troops than Caesar ever concentrates in one place in Gaul. And whether or not this was the size of the force he planned to use in his Eastern campaign, again, we don't really know. The army's very, very big, and it's been cobbled together fairly quickly, in that you've got Ventidius's troops, or some of them perhaps, and others, though many will have gone back for his triumph. You've got other legions that have been put together. So this is not a coherent team that is used to operating together. It again has more echoes of the Philippi campaign, where you have the 2 separate armies of Octavian and Antony, and even within those, this is not that well practiced and trained a group as working as a group on that scale. And the same with Brutus and Cassius, their armies remain separate. It's not just that the leaders are jealous of their position, it's very hard to integrate these forces. Everything, even the individual groups, have pushed the Roman military system close to the limits of where it's effective in terms of command and control, supply and all this sort of thing. The supply and the heavy baggage train has to be immense to deal with these sorts of numbers. There's talk of an 80-foot long shaft of a battering ram to be brought up, and that's obviously a very cumbersome thing to transport. If it's right, then put together, these are, with the Allies included, this is a bigger force than Philippi. It's certainly bigger than the army Antony himself led there, but it might even be bigger than the combined force. This is not something he has any experience of dealing with, because no Roman has any experience of dealing with forces on this scale. You know, it's double the size by the look of it, or more so than the army that Pompey had at Pharsalus, and that, you know, didn't perform as well as it might have done, and Pompey was a very experienced commander. It's, as I say, far more than Caesar ever commanded in one place in Gaul, and if he planned to do this in his eastern expedition, he didn't actually do it, and so we have no idea of how well or not that would have worked. But Caesar was a far more experienced commander than Mark Antony. Again, hopefully these videos will have put into perspective that compared to Caesar, Antony's a little bit like him, that he starts his military career comparatively late and then does a fair bit in the later stages of his life. Caesar comes into the Civil War after 10 years of command in Gaul, only a couple of years after he's commanded in Spain for a few campaigns there as well. So he's done a lot relatively recently at gradually increasing levels of numbers involved, the size of the armies involved, and scale of operations. Antony's jumping a little bit. The Philippi campaign was a relatively simple one, even though he and Octavian had to project their force over to Macedonia. There wasn't that much manoeuvring once the armies lumbered into contact, because again, they're too clumsy to do much more than that. Supply is such a problem. This is something far more ambitious when you're looking at distances of march, of operations, of campaigning are far, far bigger. So this is all new to Antony, and the scale of the army involved, but also the scale of the campaigning area, much, much bigger than anything he's dealt with in the past. He starts with a cunning plan of sorts, in that he pretends to negotiate and concentrates the army at the Euphrates, at Zeugma, on the Syrian bank. So, you know, it's again one of the main crossing places of this area that will figure throughout Roman frontier history between the Romans and their eastern neighbours for centuries to come. Has done so already. Fratres, the great king, or the king of kings, concentrates an army to meet him. So again, anticipation, but also it's a fairly familiar part of diplomacy as it will emerge between the Parthians and the Romans. You negotiate from strength. You show off your power and then say, okay, you know, we've met, but I'm willing to give you a concession because we're equals, and you know, you've presented to your home audiences, they've submitted to us, whilst the other side are doing exactly the same thing with their home audience. Possibly Antony wanted to go via Edessa, so that's about 500 miles away. That's too late, or it's blocked. But he starts to avoid him and then swings round, because he goes north and then he goes via Armenia and RVs with his allies, with Canidius's troops, and the army is getting bigger. If you look at the likely route as suggested by Plutarch and the claim, Plutarch talks about him travelling and marching his army best part of 1,000 miles just to get into position to invade Medea. So it's all very well, but it means that you've concentrated in one place, you've set up your supply there, and then you send people an incredibly long distance, hoping to confuse the enemy. The Parthians won't expect you to turn up there, they're expecting you to go into Mesopotamia, so because you know where you're going to move quicker and get there, arrive there sooner before they can either move their army or disperse that one and concentrate another army with some of the same people to face you where you're actually invading. The problem is, though, is all this takes time. That's an incredibly long distance to go, and you know, you could say, okay, 1805, the Austerlitz campaign ends up in the battle being fought in December, not perforce Ridley Scott in the snow, but nevertheless, it's late in the year. It's later than you would normally expect to be campaigning, even at that time. But that's in better conditions along better road with a highly trained army that spent several years at the camps around Boulogne getting ready. And even then, it's pretty exhausting. And some troops are only arriving on the day of battle itself. This is a lot more ambitious with a less skilled, less practiced army. But it eats up time. It's late summer before he's ready to begin the expedition. And not begin the expedition, begin the actual invasion and move into Medea, the Parthian allied It's part of the Parthian Empire, but it's often a separate kingdom, often ruled by a member of the royal family, who expects protection from the King of Kings. You know, it's this whole sub-kings and regional rulers that you have within the Parthian system. So that's really the first gamble that Antony takes. And you can't help wondering, is he thinking a little bit like the commander of a cavalry force? You know, he's done this sort of dashing thing. This is the sort of thing he's done. He's turned up, used an unexpected route and turned up sooner than his enemies have expected him in Egypt. He's tried to do the same thing in Italy with mixed success at Forum Gallorum, but nevertheless he's done this, you know. But that's easy to do with a few hundred cavalry, with an army of a few thousand, even a few legions. With an army this scale, this is far harder, and the distances involved are far greater, so it just takes time. So that's the first gamble. He attacks a city called Frata, capital of Medea. Again, Fratres is reconcentrating his army, but of course this does take time. You know, he has been wrong-footed by Antony, but on the other hand, you can't really talk about internal lines, but it is perhaps easier for him to move troops and to reform an army within his own empire than it is for Antony. Antony advances slowly, but because the terrain's difficult. You know, that's part of the reason, and this sort of broader concept, we'll go this way because this is less suitable for cavalry armies, still means it's difficult terrain, and these are roads that are not designed to take an army on this scale with a baggage train of this size. You know, you need an awful lot of food. You can't stop too much to forage. You can get some supplies from your Armenian allies, but not necessarily enough because the numbers are so big. So all of this is causing problems. All of this is difficult. Again, it's perhaps the difference between Napoleon at Austerlitz and Napoleon in 1812 in Russia. Less experienced, but far bigger army going even greater distances in terrain and over a landscape with poor roads and without the supplies, even before the Russians start acting, really to support these sorts of numbers. There aren't good roads in this area. So at this point he tries his second gamble. 300 wagons of heavy baggage and siege train are left behind, protected by 2 legions plus allied contingents, while Antony presses on with the rest to surprise the city of Frata. Again, bit of a contrast with Julius Caesar. You know, Caesar doesn't tend to split away from his baggage train like that. He might put it somewhere, settle it down in a base that's walled and fortified and protected, but doesn't leave it wandering around with a relatively small escort. Because although that's 2 legions plus your allies, 300 wagons is a lot of wagons with heavy equipment. That's always going to be a very difficult force, strung out along narrow roads, because those are the only roads that exist, such as they are. This is very hard to protect. It's very vulnerable. Fratres is in command of an army where mobility is the key to everything you do. You know, an army that's dominated by horsemen, by cavalry of various types. So again, he's got the mobility advantages even in this sort of terrain that Antony lacks, and of course he's not protecting a heavy baggage train in the same way. So he avoids Antony's main force, goes around it, and attacks and wipes out the baggage train. Again, it's too much to expect 2 legions to guard this sort of thing. They might survive if they group together and protect themselves, but then that loses the baggage train. That's their whole point for being there. The allies mostly desert or flee. There's talk of treachery. Perhaps there was from the king of Armenia. Perhaps he's just sniffing the wind and thinking, well, you know, I really want to be on the winning side. I don't think these Romans are going to be it. Antony hears about this, sends a relief force, but arrives too late, just comes to see the bodies and the debris. So he's lost his siege train, and a lot of his heavy baggage and supplies have gone, along with 2 legions as well. So that's a serious loss in manpower. It's humiliating, but this vital component, he's just begun the siege of a city, which he didn't convince to surrender when he arrived and surprised them. So he wasn't able to do that, so that's failed. And then he's lost his baggage train. That has failed. It means he doesn't have the capacity for a proper formal siege. So that's the problem. He's got no siege train, less food and equipment. He can't conduct a proper siege, and he's a very long way from home. On the other hand, he's come this far. Retreating is always difficult, big loss in prestige. It's dangerous in the face of any enemy, particularly a mobile enemy like the Parthians. So he leads out a foraging expedition. He begins the siege of the city as far as a blockade is possible, and with what limited resources and equipment he has, but that's doing things the hard way. That's never really likely to succeed. Takes out a foraging expedition with a large part of his force, hoping to lure the Parthians into battle. He does so, and convinces the Parthians to attack him, just as Ventidius had done, launches a counterattack, but the circumstances are different. The Parthians aren't so heavily committed, and they flee fairly quickly. And you may wonder just how much of the Parthian force was actually involved. It's always going to be quite difficult to judge enemy numbers when you're dealing with lots of horse archers operating in dispersed order, moving quickly, throwing up lots of dust. There is probably always a tendency to exaggerate the numbers you're facing them. The Romans apparently kill 80 Parthians, capture 30 of them. You know, these are fairly small-scale casualties, obviously very important to those involved. This is not a crushing defeat. Antony's just lost 2 legions. He's lost thousands of men just recently. This is a minor success, but most of the Parthians escape. This was, of course, a problem. You know, Publius Crassus at Carrhae had chased a Parthian force off, pursued, and then got surrounded. Catching the Parthians is a difficult thing, even if you've got horsemen, because they can disperse in different directions. And this is how, for them, this is not a retreat or a panic. This is how they fight. They disperse, reform, fight again, and come back at you. This is how they do things. They're very familiar with this. Antony attempts to negotiate. Fratres accused of treachery. You know, you have this story, or accuses the Romans of treachery. You have this great story of him greeting the Roman envoys, and he's sort of sitting on his throne, and he's playing with his bow and his bowstring. A symbol you get on a lot of Parthian coinage, and there is this sense that when the great king unstrung his bow, that meant you were fine. He wasn't going to fight you anymore. But until he did that, then it was a clear warning. I have the power, I have the ability to crush you whenever I want to. You know, I am the great king, the king of kings. The siege isn't going very well. Whilst he's been off on this expedition, there's been a sally. Some of the troops guarding the Roman positions have panicked, have broken, and Antony has some cohorts decimated. Again, something Octavian's doing. Remember, we talked in the Conquered and the Proud, the lecture about Octavian and the Augustus and the Empire, of his attempts, this rigorous, old-fashioned discipline. Antony does the same here, but he also decides to retreat because clearly this campaign isn't working very well. But again, it comes back to the problem. Withdrawing in the face of the enemy is always difficult. In the face of such a mobile enemy, exceptionally difficult. It's a different route. He's guided by a local. The Parthians break some dams, flood and impede the route. On the 3rd day of the Roman retreat, they appear again. You have the army marching in a grand square, agmen quadratus, the sort of square order of march, or 4-sided order of march. Emphasis on discipline. For 4 days they keep together. If the Romans keep together, he's got enough missile men, enough good organised legionaries, and enough cavalry that if the Parthians come close, they can be chased away. The danger is if the Romans then pursue them. Then a chap called Flavius Gallus, one of the first occurrences of the name Flavius, that's obviously later famous for the Emperor Vespasian, although again there's no reason to think of any connection, has this great idea. He wants to stay back with a rear guard and fight because we're Romans and we can beat them. He's overwhelmed. And the problem with this is that this sort of bright idea of one junior commander sucks in more and more troops because you don't want them to get wiped out. So other units go forward and supports are committed, and you're fighting on the Parthians' terms. You're sucking troops into a battle, and more of them get badly mauled. So Gallus is mortally wounded. 4 arrows in him, according to the sources. 5,000 wounded are saved, but 3,000 dead. So again, a major defeat. And of course, now you've got 5,000 wounded to look after. Remember when Crassus retreated from Carrhae, the despairing cries of the wounded being abandoned, partly what alerted the Parthians to what was going on. Antony visits the wounded. He's doing what a good Roman commander should. They tell him not to worry. We still trust you. We've still got faith in you. Speaks encouragement. Some of the beaten troops apparently asked to be decimated. It's the same sort of thing that the mutinous 10th had done to Julius Caesar when they'd had a rethink after he addressed them as Quirites, as citizens. So the morale seems to have held up on this, and this is a sign of Antony, he can inspire. He can do this at times, and that within the army they trust him. But it's obviously a difficult situation. Dio says that there would have been a lot more desertions had the Parthians not shot down many of the men who were trying to defect and trying to change side. But even so, the attacks get heavier, they get more frequent. You have an episode where the Romans form testudo, the famous locked shields. These pictures are of reenactors with the later rectangular scutum, rather than the Republican oval one, but the idea is basically the same. The Parthians see this as disorder in the ranks. The horse archers have been shooting at them, and they think, well, the infantry's panicking, the infantry they see these movements, and they charge in, at which point the Romans say, ha, this is what we wanted all along, attack them and kill quite a few of them and chase them away. So you get misunderstandings, and the Roman troops are still willing to fight, and fight with determination. There's shortages of food, though. There's shortages of hand mills to grind the grain. If it's issued as grain, grind it into flour. Stories of men grubbing for roots, trying to find what they can. Phraates offers to negotiate, tries to get the Romans onto a more open route. One of the local allies says it's a trap. So does their guide. And also a Roman captive according to Velleius, somebody who's been captured under Crassus, manages to get through to them and get word to them, look, this is a trap, they're trying to get you there. So instead, Mark Antony embarks on a night march. Men are ordered to carry water, but not enough containers. Again, all very well having the bright idea we need water, but unless you've got some means of carrying it and preserving it, then the good intention doesn't mean very much. So things start to break down. They haven't really got as far as they'd like. The Parthians are still after them. There's a breakdown in discipline during the night with a big panic where there's rumours of an attack. Hasn't in fact happened, but there's a panic goes through the camp. Baggage gets plundered. People are getting desperate. There's an account probably from Dellius, who will later change sides to join Octavian in the civil war, so is not the most reliable and was very gossipy, apparently. Again, it's one of these lost accounts, but Plutarch quotes it, where Antony had ordered one of his bodyguards to kill him. He was determined to commit suicide before he actually realises that there isn't an enemy attack. The army, there isn't imminent disaster. This is just chaos caused by poor information and people panicking. Order is restored with daylight. Antony hasn't killed himself, but again, from the early on where the army seems to be holding together, there's a clear panic and breakdown at this point, and it seems to be getting worse. They fight off attacks, though, the next day, so they're rallied enough to do that, and they're fortunate that at that point they've reached the river Artaxes on the border with Armenia after 27 days in the retreat from Phrata, and the Parthians stop. There's talk of them sort of riding up and waving them off, basically, that you're off our turf now, so we're not so bothered. Plutarch says that Antony held a parade and saw that he'd lost 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, probably not including the 2 legions with the baggage. It's a long march through rough terrain, because then you've still got to get back through Armenia. You are still a long way from home. You want to get back to Syria. That is still hundreds of miles away. And it's through difficult terrain. And of course, because you got there so late, the weather has got worse and worse. It's autumn turning into winter. Plutarch says that 8,000 more men will die during the retreat from this state, with no enemy action involved whatsoever, but simply from exposure, lack of food, sickness, giving up. Velleius, in his account, says that the total loss was a quarter of the army and half of the camp followers and almost all the baggage. And there's a strange thing that modern sources, particularly those that are trying to sort of maintain Antony's reputation, you get descriptions like, well, this was a defeat but not a disaster. Well, it's not a disaster in the sense that some people got home and the majority of your soldiers got home, but the fact that you've lost, even if it's a quarter of your troops in this campaign that has achieved nothing, then this is a major defeat. I think it qualifies as a disaster pretty well. And attempts more recently to say that the objectives were fairly limited, that he wasn't going to try and conquer the Parthian Empire, overthrow Phraates or anything like that, might be right, that he is about asserting his power within the region. Even with those more limited objectives, which do seem more realistic, this is still a colossal failure and an incredibly costly failure. And bear in mind the political background to this. Mark Antony wanted this campaign to make him the sort of military hero to stand on the same level as the Pompeys and the Caesars of this world, to do what a Roman aristocrat should do and win clean glory against a foreign enemy. He hasn't done a lot of that in his career. Yes, Philippi he's held to be the main victor, but that's fighting fellow Romans. It's distinctly dodgy. This was to be the big thing. Take on the greatest power in the world, defeat it, humble it, make it submit to Rome, come back for your triumph, for your glory, all of this thing. It's the dream of any Roman aristocrat, particularly the most ambitious, and it's failed. He has not achieved that. That's a major problem. It's probably a major problem. I do wonder, when you look at his subsequent career, whether he ever really recovers emotionally from this. Because again, some of the origins of this Antony the descendant of Hercules, Antony the great soldier, come from Antony's own projection of his own image, his own idea of how he wanted people to see him, probably how he saw himself. And now at the greatest test of his military prowess, he's failed. And he's failed in a way that he achieved nothing and lost an awful lot of his troops, and it came near to disaster to the point where he was thinking of killing himself. So this is bad. He rushes off, he eventually abandoned his army, rushes off to wait for Cleopatra on the coast of Syria. Is supposed to moon around until she arrives, and then from then onwards they're rarely apart, particularly at the important stages where he's doing things. You do have to wonder if he almost needed that support, that he couldn't really cope without her anymore, and that she's the sort of functioning one of the pair beyond this, and that he just lacks that confidence and ability to do things, because that does seem to be reflected in his last big military campaign, the Actium campaign. Yes, he goes to Armenia, and because the king of Armenia has changed side, partly through bluff, a mixture, a little bit of deception and treachery, but he captures the king of Armenia, suppresses them, but Armenia was supposed to be a Roman ally already. He's unable to do anything significant to deal with the Parthians, so instead of avenging Crassus and getting back the eagles and the standards that Octavian in later years will build up into a really big deal, Antony has lost more standards of his own and given more reasons for the Parthians to boast. And it's almost, but not quite, undone the successes of Ventilius Bassus, who've beaten the Parthians and made the Romans more confident. Now the Parthians can be confident again because they've faced up to the might of the Roman army, the biggest that's ever been put into the field, and they've seen it off their land. They've chased it away. So they're bound to feel more confident at this stage. 34 BC, you have that odd donations of Alexandria. That's more of a political thing where he makes Cleopatra, queen of kings whose sons are kings, and gives to his children with her, and plus Caesarion, large parts of the eastern Mediterranean, some of it within Roman territory, others like Parthia and India he gives out anyway, though he doesn't control it. That and the procession, when he arrives there, is able to be presented as a sort of faux triumph, and conducted like as a triumph shouldn't be, not in Rome but in this alien Hellenistic capital Alexandria, and it shows how corrupt Mark Antony has become. We don't really need to go into the propaganda of the build-up to the Civil War. 33 BC, preparations for this are already underway. An army is moved to Euphrates. Now obviously you could present that as, well, I'm going off with the Parthians, but he clearly doesn't seem to be thinking in that respect. It's a huge army, it's a huge navy. There's a reliance on brute force, on sheer numbers that you've seen working at Philippi, not working in the attack in 36 BC, and he brings it into the Actium campaign as it will come. Many of the ships are not fully manned, so you've got lots of them but you haven't got them fully crewed, and there are problems of supply. So when you finally get to Greece by 31, you have to disperse them along the coast because you can't keep them in one place and supply everybody. The plan was to wait for Octavian to come to him, just as Pompey had done for Caesar, just as Brutus and Cassius had done for Antony and Octavian, and of course it hadn't worked for either of them. A navy's not really designed for defence in this way. You can harass people trying to cross the Adriatic, but you can't seal it off. It's more there to support the aggression of the army. But again, the army's not doing anything. The army's waiting. Politically, he loses the battle and loses the initiative. Octavian is a far more successful propagandist in these years than Antony had ever been, helped by the fact that he's in Italy and Antony isn't, and that Antony has Cleopatra with him. And that's... You wonder if emotionally he couldn't really function, he couldn't make decisions unless she was there to sort of give him a helping hand. But also it's deeply embarrassing for a Roman commander presenting himself as the true leader of a true Roman republic to have a foreign Greek queen next to you, a woman. And, she's not your wife, she's your mistress, telling you what to do, or appearing to tell you what to do, or appearing even to influence you significantly in any way, is deeply embarrassing. It's one of the reasons, perhaps, why he doesn't attempt to cross to Italy, because what would he do? Leave her behind? Or if he takes her with him, then that's a serious embarrassment. To do this in Italy, that really shows up the fact that he's not a true Roman anymore, which is just what his enemy has been saying. But on the other hand, civil wars tend to get won in Italy if you attack into them. That's how Sulla does it. He goes from Greece, Macedonia, crosses to Italy, wins there. Antony doesn't attempt that. The initiative is then seized by Octavian and Agrippa, and they systematically take apart Antony's war effort. Most of this is done by Agrippa and other capable subordinates. We'll talk about him, we'll talk about them another time. But they basically pick on one base after another. Because the fleet is dispersed, detachments are overwhelmed, bases taken, the supply lines interrupted, leading to the blockade at Actium, where the army withers because they can't get supplies, in part because there's too many of them to supply properly. Again, this has stretched the Roman system really to breaking point. Doesn't help that Antony's decisions seem lackluster. He doesn't get the initiative. He doesn't really seem to know what to do. It's almost as if he doesn't have a plan very clearly and keeps reacting in a small way to what the enemy's doing. But he's always following them. He's never determining what's going to happen. He never gets to fight on his terms. The army withers. He tries to provoke a battle on land, but the enemy refuse to fight, and he's unable to force them to fight in the way that a very able general might have been able to do. And again, that's perhaps his biggest strength, because it's harder to get troops in the same numbers across the Adriatic. The fleet is very effective, but he probably would have had an advantage on land, though not necessarily a decisive one, but he can't exploit it. So he abandons the army and takes to the fleet, forms them up ready to fight. It's pretty clear that from the beginning at least some of that fleet is planning to escape and sail away. That Cleopatra squadron, the ships she has, have their sails and their masts on board, their mainsails, which you don't have for battle because of the weight, because they unbalance the ship. This is very clearly something they're planning to go. So the plan is an escape and a retreat rather than fight and win a decisive victory, at least for part of his force. Whether this is conscious and this is what he's ordered, or whether Cleopatra's decided, again, this is the way things are going, I'm not hanging around to be killed here. But again, they burn the ships they're leaving behind. This is very much a sense of, I'm abandoning the army, and okay, I'm leaving a subordinate who's going to lead it to me, but is this really what he should be doing? Is this where he should be, or should he stay with the army and appoint somebody else? He does seem to have a problem that doesn't have the same sort of able commanders like Ventidius and Asinius Pollio and people like that he's relied upon in earlier campaigns, because they've moved on, or they've retired, or they've decided they don't want to be involved. It's not encouraging. Many troops are embarked on the ships to beef up the marines on board, but still the vast bulk of the army is left behind, and basically, it's their commander waving them goodbye and saying, it's all right, chaps, I'll see you again later. Not really very good. Not what a Roman commander should do. The The breakout comes because of exploiting the winds and the tides, so to some extent predictable, but it's less than a third of the fleet. If Antony had, after doing that, sailed back and got back to the army, returned and joined them, he might still have had a chance. But he failed utterly as a Roman when he fled, when he went with Cleopatra. Yes, they take away the treasury and the money, but without the ships, without the men, you cannot simply buy an army, certainly not of the quality, and buy an army that's legitimate in Roman standards that will allow you to win a civil war and complete that victory afterwards. Roman aristocrats in command of armies do not run away. They rally the troops and prepare to fight again. Antony has broken that code by abandoning his army on shore and then abandoning a lot of his fleet as well, because some of the ships fight on and are destroyed, set on fire after he's gone. It's the same as Pompey. Caesar depicts him as the first man to run away at Pharsalus and gallops off into the sunset, but while his army is still fighting. That, again, utter failure for a Roman aristocrat. So anyone who's said that, you sometimes get these modern views, oh no, it's fine, they've got the money away, they can revive their fortunes, fight the civil war at another point, doesn't understand how Roman ideology worked. An aristocrat needs to show virtus, this courage, this ability, this leadership. It is very much that leadership. He's got to stay with his men. He's got to rally them. He's got to say, okay, I've lost today, but I'm going to win in the future. And I'm going to make sure that I work to create the situation where I'll win in the future. Antony has abandoned all of that, and that's why there's no real prospect of him ever turning around, reversing the fortunes of the civil war after this. Actium is an utter failure, a disaster for Mark Antony, his cause, and he simply can't recover from that. So any idea that sort of says, oh, this is all being very clever and he's outwitted them is nonsense. So we come really to conclusion. In the big encounters we've dealt with this time round, Antony's virtues that he's shown at a lower level are less important. He doesn't do as well. The boldness, the swift movement, the charisma even that he's shown leading smaller forces with great skill doesn't translate as well to warfare on the grand scale that he finds himself waging very much through choice in these later years. And he gathers probably too many troops for the expedition in 36 BC. Too many troops, too many ships that he can't supply in 31 BC. The thinking that, well, I need as many as I can because that'll, I'm sure, ensure that I win. Obviously, it's logical, it's very attractive, but the military system doesn't support this sort of scale of operation. It makes everything very hard. It requires a commander of exceptional ability rather than of, more average ability that Antony shows. And the greatest virtues he had displayed as a commander don't work at that level. So the personal touch, the being there on the spot to make things happen is fine, but how are you supervising? How are you making the rest of the army work? That relies on everybody else doing their job. The bigger the army gets, the harder it is to make sure that everybody at every level knows what they're doing and will do it when required upon. Supply is the Achilles heel in both these operations. He doesn't, over the distances, if he's marching 1,000 miles before he actually begins the invasion in 36 BC, with this, even if it's not 100,000 men, this very large body of troops, and remember those estimates don't include the camp followers, who are clearly substantial, but all need to eat, they all need to drink. You can't move as fast as he wants to. He's deeply frustrated by the terrain, by the progress of his army, which means that he starts to gamble by doing these things. He attacks late in the season because what he's done earlier has meant that he's wasted the summer, or at least the summer has been consumed in other activities. The level of surprise achieved in 36 isn't enough to give him victory. After that, he'll then gamble again. Well, I'll rush forward to blockade the city and arrive there and maybe convince them to surrender. The siege train can catch up with me when they get a chance. Loses the siege train, can't conduct the siege because he hasn't got the equipment to do it anymore. Also supply problems. If he could have persuaded the Parthians to fight a battle and commit themselves as fully as Ventidius had done, maybe it would have worked. But again, Ventidius was dealing with a smaller army, and probably a smaller Parthian army as well. And at a time when the Parthians were overconfident. They've become cautious because of his victories. But Antony isn't able to make things work. So Similar things will be seen in the Actium campaign. Rely on size, sheer numbers, sheer resources, but then you have far greater supply problems than you'd have with a more manageable army that you can't really answer. You know, your fleet is suffering. You don't have full crews for your ships. People are dying of sickness. Plutarch tells a story about, you know, from his family memory and his community memory, people being conscripted to carry grain on their backs to Antony's base at Actium from Chaeronea. And you're relying on all these measures that are only temporary, are never going to be that satisfactory, because the amount of food that somebody can carry compared to the amount they have to eat during that journey it's not an efficient way of doing things, and that won't, with the numbers you have in your fleet, in your army, that will be consumed so quickly that the problem is there all the time. So Antony tries to wage war on a scale that the Roman system doesn't really cope with very well, nor would any system in the ancient world, but also that he in particular has no experience of doing, doesn't really have the sort of army with the sort of subordinates that could have maybe made this work, or work well enough for long enough for you to win victory. He still seems to be thinking very much in terms of leading smaller armies, doing the same sort of thing. Let's move fast, let's surprise them, let's outflank them, all this sort of thing, which is fine. It's just that you can't do it. You can't do it as quickly. You can't move as fast. You can't surprise as easily with the sheer numbers you've got involved. And arriving with a smaller force there doesn't achieve, even if it's a short-term victory, it doesn't achieve a big enough victory to win the campaign for you. So all of this is problematic. He simply can't do what he used to do. So the impression is really of Antony that overall you have somebody who was by Roman standards, a decent commander with reasonable levels of experience, was very capable at the lower levels, but as he rose higher, as he had greater responsibilities, is less efficient, is less good at the job, because it requires skills and abilities that he does not possess. Perhaps also time to create an army and a navy and train them well enough and prepare them well enough that they can actually perform this as well. So, in a sense, you're still trying to do, at a lower level, you can improvise. A general can do an awful lot by rushing around and making things work. That just becomes harder and harder when everything is bigger. You simply can't be everywhere. That failure against the Parthians sealed his fate. From 36, it was very hard to see how he could come back unless he accepted a equal, perhaps subordinate status to Octavian and returned home to politics there, and admitted, well, I haven't got a triumph, I haven't got a genuine one, I can't really, even though he sort of parades it as such and claims to have won, it's pretty obvious that he hasn't. And then he fails in the most important things for a Roman aristocrat. At Actium, he runs away. He flees, he lives to fight another day with his money, but not with his soldiers, not with his fleet. And that's not what a Roman aristocrat should do. So, had things been different, had the civil wars not happened, we might remember Antony as quite a capable soldier, a good leader, at that lower level, and at the medium level as well, and an associate of Julius Caesar who'd done quite well. If Caesar hadn't died, who knows how we'd remember Mark Antony, because things might have been very, very different in the years to come. He does seem to get promoted beyond the level of his ability. Octavian manages this by finding people like Agrippa, and he has the great advantage that the fleet he controls in the Actium campaign has been honed by fighting Sextus Pompey for all those years and by those victories. So he brings a very practiced, experienced and confident team, whereas Antony has cobbled together lots of people who haven't fought at all before, are inexperienced, don't know each other, and then gets lots of them together, which magnifies all the problems of making the system work. So there are other factors as well. But today we were talking very much about Antony the soldier, Antony the commander. In the second half of his career, in these later years, it is very much the Antony the commander on the grandest scale possible. At that level, he does not perform very well. And it does seem to reflect that, yes, the system struggles at that level, but also that he never really adapted or found any way of dealing with this. So anyway, that's my take on Antony the soldier. You can read a lot more about this in the Antony and Cleopatra book, where I go into this in far greater detail. There's little bits as well, obviously the relevant sections of The Eagle and the Lion, Rome and Persia, where we deal with these sections and look in more detail at the context of the expedition to Medea. So that's my take on Antony. Able in many ways, personally and individually very brave, but you could look at plenty of commanders throughout history who have been superb at a lower level but have failed when they've got to division or corps or army, because it requires different skills. And some people suddenly discover that they have those skills or can learn them, others don't and lack them, and they don't really know what to do, and they try and do the same things they've done before, and it rarely works. You could add that these two campaigns are fought against very dangerous opponents. So up against the Parthians, the Parthians know what they're doing. They haven't conquered this empire by being inefficient militarily, so even though there's weakness in the change of power, nevertheless, they're still a formidable opponent. And you are fighting them on their turf, which is a difficult and dangerous thing to do, as the experience of later campaigns will show. It's interesting that Antony's army does perform better, that it shows that if you keep discipline, you can actually march around and the Parthians can harass you but not stop you from going anywhere. That's a lesson that will be expanded upon in later periods and later conflicts. And then in the Civil War, he fights against Agrippa, perhaps more than Octavian. Agrippa is the real military mastermind behind it, with a very good and experienced fleet. And Agrippa, sadly, we know far less about him than we'd like to know, because he did keep to the shadows. But this was a man with a very practical turn. And remember, he's younger than Antony. He's learned on the job how to do all of this, but he does seem to have been one of those people with a great capacity to learn and an immense natural talent as well for all sorts of things, but particularly in the military and naval sphere. So again, Antony's come up against a very tough opponent. But if you look at the latter period of Antony's career, he doesn't cut a particularly good figure as a commander. It's probably, as I say, this change in level. So hopefully that's a balanced account between these two talks of Antony's military career. Say, personally brave, good at certain things, good at the lower level stuff, a very gifted subordinate, and at the same time quite a gifted politician, an able politician who ends up, in a sense, advancing or being promoted beyond his capacity, faces very difficult opponents and doesn't manage to cope. In many ways, until you get to the Civil War period, his career was not that unusual by Roman standards, and there were probably other Roman commanders, other Roman aristocrats who displayed similar levels of ability, but perhaps Antony was more gifted than most. It's very hard to say. We know more about him because of what he goes on to do. There are lots of people who are almost anonymous within the record because they never quite rise to that level. They don't come from the same sort of family, and they don't get and seize the opportunities of someone like Mark Antony. But Roman aristocrats on the whole were fairly capable soldiers. Antony may have been better than average. He certainly gets more opportunities, and he does some great things, and he was individually brave. He could be a great leader, but he could also fail at other times. So he wasn't perfect. He wasn't a Pompey, he wasn't a Caesar, he wasn't a Lucullus, he wasn't probably even an Agrippa. But nevertheless, he was not an absolute incompetent. It's just that he gets put in a position where he can't really cope and doesn't really manage. And then that failure in 36 BC, I suspect, has such an emotional impact because what he most wanted as a Roman aristocrat, he's failed to achieve. And from that, his behaviour, he never seems to be quite as determined as he had been before. But again, that might be fatigue as well. He's been doing a lot and operating and commanding a lot. He's been on campaign a lot in this period. And bear in mind as well, by Actium, he's well into late middle age. Because of Caesar being the older lover to Cleopatra, we tend to remember and think of Antony as always this comparatively young man. But he isn't by this stage. He's wearing out as well. Anyway, that's my take on Antony the Commander. Starts us off in February. Next time we're probably back to the Conquered and the Proud, but we'll see how things go, and we'll continue with various themes as this month goes on. But anyway, thanks for watching.